The smell reached the farm before the trucks did. Sweet. Sharp. Almost like fresh cider beginning to ferment. Nathan looked up from repairing a fence. They're early. Margaret smiled. Harvest started ahead of schedule. Moments later, free dump trucks rolled slowly through the front gate. Their trailers overflowed with apples. Bruised apples. Split apples. Misshapen apples. Some carried hail scars. Others had minor insect marks. A few had begun to soften. Perfectly edible. Impossible to sell in grocery stores. The packing house manager climbed down. You still taking everything? Margaret nodded. I've cleared the whole equipment yard. He laughed. Good. He looked back at the trucks. We've got 55 tons this week. Nathan whistled. That's a mountain of apples. The manager smiled. To us, it's a disposal problem. Margaret looked across the trailers. To me, she smiled. It's next year's business. The arrangement had started almost by accident. The Hale farm bordered one of the state's largest apple packing houses. Every autumn, thousands of tons of apples arrived from regional orchards. Only perfect fruit reached supermarket shelves. Everything else became Cull apples. Some were sent for livestock feed. Some became compost. Some simply rotted. Disposal cost the packing house thousands of dollars every season. 5 years earlier, the manager had stopped by Margaret's farm. I've got an unusual question. Margaret smiled. I usually like unusual questions. He pointed toward the packing house. We're paying people to haul away apples. She nodded. I've noticed. What if? He hesitated. You took them instead? Margaret looked toward an unused gravel lot behind the old machine shed. It served no real purpose anymore. I've got room. Neither realized that handshake would quietly transform both businesses. Every harvest season, trucks arrived. Week after week. Load after load. Mountains of apples grew behind a barn. Neighbors couldn't understand it. Naturally. Saturday morning found the county diner full. Dale Harper folded his newspaper. You hear what Margaret's collecting now? Rick looked up. What? Rotten apples. Several farmers laughed. How many? Truckloads. Another rancher grinned. I drove past yesterday. Silence. I thought she'd started her own landfill. The room erupted. Margaret walked inside carrying hydraulic hose fittings. Dale waved. Morning. Morning. He smiled. So. She laughed. So. Planning to open a pie factory? No. Cider? No. What then? Margaret smiled. I don't know yet. The room laughed again. The answer sounded strange. Except it wasn't entirely true. She knew exactly what fascinated her. She simply hadn't figured out how far it could go. The idea began years earlier with Samuel Hale. One rainy afternoon, Margaret found him filling a small oak barrel with crushed apples. She frowned. Those are the bruised ones. Samuel nodded. They're the sweetest. She looked confused. Why waste the good barrels on bad apples? Samuel smiled. Because Vinegar doesn't care what grocery stores think. He placed the barrel beneath the old equipment shed. It only cares about sugar. That barrel quietly fermented for nearly a year. When Samuel finally opened it, the sharp aroma filled the entire barn. Margaret dipped one finger. Bright. Complex. Nothing like ordinary white vinegar. Samuel smiled. Some products improve after everyone else gives up on them. Years later, she remembered every word. Instead of selling fresh apples, she became fascinated with what happened after apples stopped looking perfect. She studied fermentation, acetobacter cultures, oak aging, natural vinegar production, not industrial vinegar, traditional vinegar, slow vinegar. She enrolled in weekend food preservation workshops, visited small cider makers, read books written a century earlier. Nathan found them scattered across the kitchen table. You're doing it again. Margaret looked up. What? The books. Silence. The books. They always become another business. She laughed. They usually do. The first production season proved messy. Very messy. Margaret sorted apples by hand. Discarded only truly spoiled fruit. Everything else became fresh juice. The juice fermented into hard cider, then slowly transformed into vinegar. Some batches failed. Others developed strange flavors. One entire barrel leaked. Another attracted fruit flies despite careful cleaning. Nathan watched vinegar running across the workshop floor. That can't be good. Margaret laughed. It's expensive. She saved every failed batch. Not because it could be sold. Because mistakes taught faster than success. Samuel always believed failed experiments deserved notebooks. Successful ones only deserved repetition. The county health inspector visited during the second season. He walked slowly through the processing room. Clean tanks, oak barrels, glass carboys, everything spotless. He nodded approvingly. This isn't what I expected. Margaret smiled. What did you expect? Honestly, he looked around. I expected homemade cider. Instead, he found a carefully designed artisan vinegar workshop, temperature-controlled aging room, laboratory testing equipment, oak barrel storage. Everything organized, everything measured. Margaret refused shortcuts. Industrial vinegar could be produced within days. Her batches aged 6 months, sometimes a year. Flavor mattered more than speed. The first bottles reached a small farmer's market that autumn. Only 3 varieties: classic apple cider vinegar, oak-aged reserve, wildflower-infused artisan blend. Most shoppers walked past, until one local chef stopped. He sampled each bottle carefully, then looked at Margaret. You made this? She nodded. He tasted the oak-aged vinegar again. Finally, he smiled. I've been importing vinegar from Europe. Silence. I don't think I need to anymore. He bought every bottle on the table. The following week, he ordered another case. Then another. Word spread quietly through restaurant kitchens. Chefs talked. Food writers noticed. One regional magazine published a small article. The farmer making vinegar from apples nobody else wanted. The headline caught attention. Soon specialty food stores called. Then gourmet shops. Then wineries. Everyone asked the same question. Can you produce more? Margaret looked toward the mountains of apples arriving every autumn. I think so. The packing house manager returned that harvest. This time he walked into a busy processing building instead of an empty machine shed. Workers washed apples, pressed fresh juice, filled fermentation tanks. Oak barrels lined the walls. The rich aroma of apples and aging vinegar filled the air. He looked around quietly, then smiled. You know something? Margaret looked up. What? We've been paying people to haul away your inventory. She laughed. It certainly feels that way. He stopped beside a barrel, quietly aging beneath handwritten labels. How many bottles will this become? Margaret smiled. About 300. He looked back toward another convoy of trucks unloading bruised apples outside. Then back at the aging barrels. Finally he laughed. I've got a question. She folded her arms. Go ahead, if restaurants already can't buy enough. He looked across the processing room filled with quietly aging oak barrels. What happens when the gourmet grocery chains discover you? The packing house manager looked around the processing room. Rows of oak barrels rested quietly in the aging cellar. Freshly pressed cider bubbled inside stainless fermentation tanks. Glass bottles lined wooden shelves waiting for labels. He smiled. What happens when the gourmet grocery chains discover you? Margaret looked toward the oldest barrels. They'll have to wait. The manager laughed. I'm serious. So am I. Nathan looked confused. You wouldn't expand? Margaret smiled. I would. Silence. But I won't rush fermentation. That became the foundation of the company. Demand would never decide quality. Tom would. The first regional gourmet chain contacted her 3 months later. Their buyers sampled 6 vinegars during a food show. He paused after tasting the barrel-aged reserve, then tasted it again. Finally he asked, how many bottles can you ship every month? Margaret answered honestly, not enough. The buyer laughed. I appreciate honesty. She smiled. I'd rather disappoint someone today than every customer next year. Instead of rejecting the order, he reduced it. We'll start small. That decision changed everything. Within weeks, the vinegar appeared on specialty grocery shelves throughout the state. Food writers noticed first. One magazine described the oak-aged vinegar as having layers of baked apple, caramel, toasted oak, and wildflower honey. Chefs began requesting private barrel selections. Boutique restaurants proudly listed the farm's name directly on their menus. Nathan walked into the office carrying another stack of purchase orders. We've got another problem. Margaret looked up. The waiting list. He nodded. 9 months. She smiled. That's manageable. He handed her another folder. This one makes it 16. She quietly closed the binder. We're still not rushing. The old machine shed behind the farmhouse slowly transformed. The gravel lot where rotten apples once rotted became a beautiful fermentation campus. Long rows of French and American oak barrels filled climate-controlled buildings. Natural stone floors helped regulate temperature. Visitors walked elevated wooden catwalks overlooking the aging room. The sweet aroma of apples mixed with toasted oak filled the air. One afternoon, the county health inspector returned. He stopped in the center of the barrel room. Sunlight filtered through tall windows. Hundreds of quietly aging barrels stretched into the distance. He laughed. "I remember when this place had fruit flies." Margaret smiled. "So do I. You've built something remarkable." She looked around. The apples built it. The biggest surprise came from the packing house itself. Its quality manager arrived carrying several old production records. "I found something." Margaret looked up. "What?" He spread faded paperwork across the table. For nearly 20 years, the packing house had paid enormous disposal fees every harvest season. Millions of pounds of Cull apples had left the property with almost no value returned. He shook his head. "We kept calling them waste." Margaret smiled. "They were inventory." The manager nodded. "We just didn't know it." The partnership expanded. Instead of random truckloads, the packing house created a dedicated sorting line. Bruised apples suitable for vinegar were separated immediately. Only fruit truly beyond use became compost. Everything else headed to the Hale farm. Waste nearly disappeared. The local newspaper noticed. Its headline covered nearly the entire front page. "Nothing wasted. Local partnership saves thousands of tons of apples." Soon agricultural universities requested tours. Food science students filled the fermentation buildings. One professor asked Margaret, "When did you realize this could become a premium product?" She smiled. "I didn't." The students looked surprised. "You didn't." "I realized it could become an honest product." Silence. The premium part came later. That answer stayed with many of them. One autumn, a famous restaurant owner flew in from New York. He spent nearly an hour tasting different barrel vintages. Some aged 12 months. Others nearly 3 years. He finally placed his tasting glass on the table. "I've got a question." Margaret folded her arms. "Go ahead. Would you create a private reserve exclusively for our restaurants?" She thought for a moment. "Yes. But," he smiled. "I can hear the but. You don't choose the release date." He laughed. "The vinegar does." The reserve eventually spent 32 months in oak before Margaret considered it ready. The restaurant owner later admitted it became the most talked about condiment on his menu. Visitors purchased bottles simply because they had tasted it with dinner. The company quietly grew beyond vinegar. Apple shrubs, barrel-aged glazes, small batch drinking vinegars, chef blends infused with herbs grown on the Hale farm. Yet vinegar always remained the heart of the business. Every bottle still began exactly the same way. A bruised apple. One rainy afternoon, Dale Harper visited the processing facility. He slowly walked between towering stacks of freshly delivered apples. Forklifts carried wooden bins toward the press. Workers sorted fruit with remarkable speed. Nothing looked rotten. Nothing looked wasted. Dale picked up one scarred apple. "I would have fed this to cattle." Margaret smiled. "So would I." He looked surprised. "You would, after making vinegar." They both laughed. Dale shook his head. "You know what still bothers me?" Margaret already knew. I laughed. "You did. I drove past these piles every fall." He looked around. "I thought I was looking at garbage." Margaret gently turned the apple in her hand. "No." "What then?" "Flavor." The following year, the State Tourism Board added the Hale Vinegar Company to its culinary trail. Thousands of visitors toured the farm annually. Families watched apples become juice. Juice become cider. Cider slowly transform into vinegar. Children especially loved the oldest barrel in the building, Samuel's original oak barrel, the same one Margaret had watched him fill decades earlier. She never sold vinegar from it. Instead, every new batch received a small starter culture drawn from that original living vinegar. One little boy asked during a tour, "Why don't you empty the old barrel?" Margaret smiled. "Because every bottle we make carries a little piece of where we started." The guide smiled quietly. "So the first barrel is still working?" Margaret nodded. Every day. Late one autumn evening, Margaret stood beside that same barrel after the visitors had gone home. The processing room had grown quiet. Only the gentle sound of fermentation filled the air. She remembered Samuel standing in this very spot, holding bruised apples everyone else ignored. She finally understood something he never had to explain. He wasn't making vinegar because the apples were damaged. He was making vinegar because the apples still had something left to give. Years earlier, the packing house saw 55 tons of bruised apples every autumn. They saw disposal costs, hauling fees, waste. Most people saw fruit that had already failed. Margaret saw sugar, natural yeast, time. and generations of knowledge hidden inside a process almost forgotten. She never tried to convince people rotten apples were beautiful. She simply proved they were still valuable. By the time gourmet chefs, specialty grocers, and restaurants across the country proudly displayed bottles from the Hale farm, nobody remembered the mountains of bruised apples behind the machine shed. They remembered the vinegar. But Margaret never forgot, because every bottle sitting on those polished wooden shelves began exactly the same way.